going to do an experiment. Audience participation, okay? Ordinarily, as the folks who have attended this regularly know, I like to work on the background of our current historical situation. Most of what goes on in the news and most of what goes on in entertainment, that's the boardwalk, and it's intended to distract you. The real action is where you're not looking. Just as with a magician, the real action is where you're not supposed to be looking. Current events have taken a peculiar turn in the last year and a half, but especially in the last month. So that although we're going to be dealing with fake history and fake science for the next several weeks, today in particular we're going to be dealing with fake news, which is also fake history, but it also comes into the present situation. That's as background for the experiment we're about to use. I want you to pretend that you are a resident of Salem, Massachusetts in, I think it was 1639, but I'm not certain of the date, but you'll know what I'm talking about. At the height of the frenzy, people had been dying in the winter. They'd been suffering a multitude of economic and survival disasters. And these 6 girls accused an ugly old woman of being a witch. We saw her performing a Satan's rite, a Satan's mass. Okay? So put yourself in that situation, and the parson and the chief of the village of Salem had called the people together to get the testimonies of these 6 teenage and preteen girls. And as each of the preteen girls or teenagers were telling their lurid story about what they saw this old woman witch doing, the younger sister of one of the girls stands up and says, "Parson, Daddy, I was there. The old lady was just cooking your meal. Nothing happened." Now, you are a citizen of Salem, Massachusetts, and you and every resident in that town is frightened of the future, is frightened of your survival, and is frightened of witches. What do you think of this little girl? I know it's a little hard.
Which part are we supposed to play?
You're supposed to tell me what you think of this little girl's contrary testimony.
And we're not us as we are in 20.
Pardon?
We're not us in 2018.
We're one of those citizens.
We've got to have a mindset of.
You've got to have a mindset of a 1630 person afraid of witches, afraid of the devil, and frankly afraid of the future. What would you think of this little girl saying, "Daddy, all she was doing was fixing her supper"?
Can I ask you a question about I am a little hazy on the context. This is in the
1630s, just around the time of the Salem witch trials.
And is this the church that Cotton Mather?
Yeah.
Cotton
Yeah.
Mather, okay.
Yeah.
And Increase Mather.
I'm kind of stretching your imagination. Dawn, do you have a question or suggest
No.
an answer?
Probably, I would say, she's the daughter of the devil. She's lying to protect.
Gotcha! I knew you were bright. No, I'm serious. When someone gives contrary testimony, when you are primed to hear the other story, your first response is going to be to accuse the person giving the contrary testimony.
Yep.
And the more frightened you are, the less informed you are, the more likely you're to give that answer. I want you to remember that because it applies to the fake news we are hearing today, that we're going to be dealing with today, and it applies in a different, slightly different fashion with what we're going to be dealing with next week as well. When people tell you what you don't want to hear, do you believe them or do you accuse them of being a participant in the evil? Okay? Joe?
I'm not interested in throwing a monkey wrench in this, but when we hear people talking about keeping Guantanamo open, what's Guantanamo all about? Besides a witch hunt?
Depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
Guantanamo to the military-industrial complex is a place where they can extract information that they want. They can extract the report that they want to extract. The best use of torture is to get a confession. It's absolutely useless for getting information, but it's very, very good at extracting confessions. Now, from the point of view of the responsible citizen, Guantanamo is all about your government torturing people. From the point of view of the military-industrial complex, it's about getting the kind of confession that you want. So you've got two different audiences.
You know, but those people have been down there now 10 years, 13 years, 15 years. There's 40 of them left.
The problem there is, and I don't want to get sidetracked, and this is what you're trying to do.
No, I'm not trying, I'm really not.
I know you're not. I know you're not. The problem is they don't know. Now that they have discarded terrorists, they don't know what to do with them. And several of the countries that have been asked to take these discarded terrorists back have said no way in hell. And frankly, I can understand it. These people, their lives have been destroyed. You have no idea what time bombs are clicking in their head. So, with that in mind, the fact that your first instinct is going to be to torture, or not to torture, but to challenge the contrary information. Now, am I at least getting sound here? I want to find out if I got sound. A partial history of our fake news, or shall we vote to decide what gender Pepper is? Pepper is my cat at home. And the question comes up,
You're gonna trip.
Good, thank you. Some innocent person took a kitten to their kindergarten class. And the kids were playing with the kitten, and someone said, "What sex is it?" And none of the students at the kindergarten class were quite sure, but one of the students at the kindergarten class knew that a lot of questions were decided by vote. So he suggested, let's vote to decide what gender the kitten is. Which raises the very good question, and it's going to come up next week as well. Are questions of history or are questions of science best answered with a study of the subject or with a vote on what people think the answer is? Come on, let's put this on the slideshow basis. The story is widely recognized that William Randolph Hearst told his photographer down in 1898, "You give me the pictures, I'll provide you the war." The reference, of course, is the Spanish-American War of 1898 to 1900. The battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, and the photographer provided a lot of pictures that the caption said, this is this part of the conflict and this is this part of the conflict, and William Randolph Hearst provided the narrative. The main the questions comes up. The Maine was either destroyed by sabotage of someone in its own crew for the purposes of creating the war, or it was a munitions explosion, quite accidental. In either case, the occasion of the Spanish-American War had nothing to do with the Spanish attacking the Maine. Spanish-American War was the first imperial war of the United States, where the United States government acquired control of territory beyond the continental United States. Puerto Rico, the Philippines, eventually the Hawaiian Islands, just another story, and they graciously granted Cuba independence with an asterisk. As in many cases, their independence was totally predicated on them doing what the government said they should do. Technically, they had independence. Here you've got this behemoth a few miles to the north saying, you know, we'd really like it if you did this and this and this. We have ways of punishing you if you don't. I'm going to play this as loud as I can.
The year is 1917, and Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. Congressional Record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed in each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, the CFR maintains that its goal is to increase America's understanding of the world. However, the actual objective of this highly exclusive club is revealed by the rare admissions of the insiders themselves. In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world. And the CFR is their most visible conduit for carrying out that agenda.
That report started with in 1917 and spoke about what Quigley found out in the 50s and 60s. The CFR was established in 1921, and the principle of controlling the American people by controlling what they read had been established at least a decade before that.
What's CFR mean?
Council on Foreign Relations.
Okay.
It, along with the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, the something Grove, there's another so-called secret society. Bohemian Grove, thank you, Janet. These are elite clubs with a lot of overlap, where basically the elite gather sometimes for pleasure and sometimes for making world-type decisions. I decided today to turn my attention to fake news because of something that appeared very recently in the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. This report which was written by two senior fellows of the Council on Foreign Relations, declared, they didn't call for, they declared that the United States was already involved in a new Cold War with Russia. Now, because of what has been taking place in the media and in the federal government, people like Stephen Cohen have been saying that we are in a new Cold War already. The fact that it was declared by an organ of the CFR says that it's now officially recognized. They didn't say that we should be in a Cold War, they said we are in one, which is enormously dangerous, especially in view of the fact that there's no real reason for a new Cold War. All of the foundation, all of the bases for which the news media is saying Russia is hostile to the United States is smoke and mirrors. It's a golem that is made out of what is this candy that is spun into a
Cotton candy.
cotton candy? It's a golem that is made out of cotton candy. But the Council on Foreign Relations Journal speaks for the ruling elite, which means that as far as the ruling elite of this country is concerned, we are in fact in a Cold War with Russia. This storyline dovetails perfectly with the recent fake news of Russian interference in American politics. Woodrow Wilson, J.P. Morgan, and other bankers and many industrialists were very eager to get the United States involved in World War I. I'm going to point out, the United States is protected by two long sea coasts and a very benign northern border and a very benign southern border. There's no chance in hell that a foreigner is going to invade the United States. But there's a lot of money to be made in banking during World War I and a lot of money to be made in manufacturing armaments in World War I. Problem was, the American people weren't at all interested in getting involved in World War I. Even the sinking of the Lusitania didn't get the American people riled up to say, let's go get the Huns. British Zionists made a bargain with the British government. They went to the British government, and this can be documented now, said this, that they and their American fellow Jews would deliver the United States into the war on the British side in exchange for getting Palestine when the war is over. Now I want to point out that up until this time, the Gentile-owned newspapers were perfectly willing to back the bankers and the industrialists, let's go to war. They needed the important newspapers, that many of which, and especially the New York Times, were already owned by American Jews. And when I say American Jews, I really should say American Zionists, but they're also Jewish, so however you want to phrase that. And it wasn't until the American primary newspapers, like the New York Times, got on board that the American people were sufficiently brainwashed to be willing to get involved in the war. Now, in the process of that brainwashing, all kinds of public relations were called into play in order to brainwash them. The American Jews were not at all interested initially in getting involved in World War I because they hated Tsarist Russia. Tsarist Russia had persecuted Russian Jews for at least previous 2 centuries. At least that's what they've been told. And there's some historical documentation for that. So as long as Germany was fighting Russia, they wanted Germany to win. It was only when Britain promised the Jews Palestine that American Jews were willing to flip sides and back the Allies, France, Britain, and Russia against Germany and Turkey. Careful editing, edited reporting, and selective excision of information are also forms of fake news in 1914, 15, and 16, and in 2017 and 18. I want to point out that Abraham Lincoln imprisoned editors who criticized him over the war, the Civil War, and he expelled politicians who were opposed to his principles. He behaved like a dictator. He defended it in saying that he was protecting and preserving the Union. I would submit that he was not preserving the Union that was created in 1787. He was recreating a different kind of Union. And undoubtedly, I would be either expelled or executed for saying what I've just said if I were living in Lincoln's time and had a hearing. Woodrow Wilson got the Sedition Act of 1918 passed, and Wilson reproduced the activities of Abraham Lincoln. He jailed Eugene Debs. By passing the law, he silenced a lot of critics of getting involved in World War I. In World War II, Ezra Pound was silenced. He was put in an asylum for the insane for 10 years for broadcasting that the United States had no business being involved in the war in Europe. He was one of the more sane people in Europe at the time. That's one way of silencing people who report a story that you don't want the public to hear. Another way of silencing the story is to simply ignore them. Douglas Reed was a very popular and prominent journalist in the 30s and 40s. When he started writing the various accounts of Jewish influence in Europe and Jewish Zionism in Palestine, he became persona non grata. His most important work, The Controversy of Zion, he wrote after his journalist career was over in the 1950s. He knew it wasn't going to be published. It's now available in PDF form online, fortunately. But he recognized that because of who he was fighting, he was going to disappear. If not physically, at least literally. Benjamin Friedman was the manager of the Palmolive Soap Company. He's essentially disappeared from American history. He's no longer in, what is that journal of important people in the United States? There's a handbook of VIPs of the United States. He's no longer in it. Dorothy Thompson was the most important female. She was second most influential woman in the United States behind Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s. In the 1940s, she visited Palestine and started writing about Zionist atrocities in Palestine. Guess what? She's disappeared. When you go to the Wikipedia page on the film Woman of the Year, if I recall correctly, starring Katharine Hepburn, that storyline was predicated on the life story of Dorothy Thompson. But I know you sometimes appreciate Wikipedia, Dawn. The Wikipedia essay doesn't mention a word about Dorothy Thompson being the inspiration for the film Woman of the Year. People who oppose the deep state and people who oppose Zionist Jewish state, not just Israel, but the influence of Zionist Jews in the United States, they disappear from history. Wilfrid Burchett, he's an Australian citizen. He had the audacity to go to Hiroshima when journalists were forbidden to visit Japan. And when he was on the train going to Hiroshima from where he ever took off, He was advised by one of the few Americans on the train to not smile because everyone in this train hates your guts. Because he was clearly a Westerner. When he got to Hiroshima, he basically found acres and acres and acres of smoldering ash when he visited the few hospitals that were still extant. One of the surgeons told him after he was there for a little while, "I'm sorry, sir, you have to leave. I cannot guarantee your safety." The Japanese doctors and surgeons were dealing with what they called the atomic plague. We now know it as radiation poisoning. They tried, the disease had the symptoms of acute vitamin poison, shortage. And when they tried to give vitamin injections, the injection sites became necrotic and wouldn't stop oozing and bleeding because the poor victims had no platelets with which to clot their blood. Because Burchett had the audacity, the temerity to report this information to the Western press, he was stripped of his Australian passport. He became a man without a country. He continued his journalistic work, but he had an incredibly difficult time getting his work published in the West. He started reporting on the Vietnam War from the point of view of the people living in the jungle, because there was no audience for him by the people living in the cities. He became an unperson. There are two interconnected power centers that have become active in controlling our news recently, and they've been in control of our news since at least the election of Woodrow Wilson. Those two power centers are interlocked like this, and in the last 15 to 20 years they've become more tightly interlocked than ever. And that is the Zionist Jewish cabal and the ruling elites of the Western world. I say the Western world because it no longer is simply the ruling elites of the United States. You have to include Britain, you have to include France, you have to include Germany, you have to include Belgium. There aren't that many ruling elites in the rest of the Western world, or in Western Europe, but you have to include them. After all, the Bilderberg Group was initially hosted by the Queen of the Netherlands. In the last 15 to 20 years, their interests basically are not just together, they are locked together. And the only way I see the Zionist influence dying is when the Western world dies, but that's another point to be made. Since the first Gulf War, the two centers have been largely locked together. And the first Gulf War is an interesting pivot point because it was conducted by George Herbert Walker Bush, who was not a Zionist himself. Indeed, he considered the neoconservative Zionists who were in the basement of the House of Representatives as crazies. But they both believed in American hegemony. The deep state of the United States because it was the golem that could get them what they wanted in terms of world control. The Zionists because the golem could get them what they wanted in terms of Middle Eastern control, including the establishment of Greater Israel from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is the ultimate goal. For years I was reluctant to say it that way, but the more I see the behavior of the Zionists, I'm convinced that they are right. It's the only country in the world who will not declare what their borders are. And we're not talking about saying this is a disputed border or this is a disputed border, the way India and China have a disputed border between them. They recognize what their recognized borders are. They recognize that this is this. We're not talking about. Israel simply says, we're not saying what our borders are. I made the mistake of reading part of The Hidden History of Zionism and watching the day Israel attacked America. It's a mistake because I like to be
This week I sat down with Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and best-selling author, who's reported from war zones in Latin America, the Middle East, and beyond. His most recent book is titled Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. Hedges is also the host of the new show on Telesur English, Days of Revolt, with new episodes airing every Monday night. From someone who's been on the receiving end of bullets from El Salvador to Iraq and covered uprisings from North Africa to Europe, I wanted to talk to him about war, propaganda, and revolt. Chris, Eugene Debs, famous socialist candidate back during World War I, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his opposition to it. And in fact, the Sedition Act made it illegal for anyone to speak in opposition to the war at that time. What does that say about the myth of democracy from that early on?
Well, it says that if you challenge the structures of power, and in particular, particularly military power, you are at best marginalized, if not imprisoned. You know, those kind of few radical voices that held fast, Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams, Eugene Debs, were excoriated in the press. Emma Goldman eventually deported, along with Alexander Berkman and others. So, yeah, it's, war, as Randolph Bourne said, is the health of the state. And what you saw in World War I was the rise of the military corporate machine, which made war against these radicals through the Sedition Act, the Espionage Act, and more importantly, the Committee for Public Information, or the Creel Commission, which created the system of modern mass propaganda, employing the understanding of crowd psychology pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and Sigmund Freud, that people were not moved by fact or reason. They were moved by the very skillful manipulation of emotion. And it worked. So you had, Hollywood was making films like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin. The Creel Commission had its own news division. You couldn't even write anti-war editorials. It was against the law. It had speakers bureaus, and you only had to use the Sedition Act and espionage on those kind of few figures who held fast to an anti-war stance, of which there were not many. And you read people like Jane Addams, and part of what they are most depressed about is how easily the intellectual class, even the purportedly left intellectual class, was seduced into the war effort. And then after the war, the dreaded Hun becomes the dreaded Red, and we enter what Dwight McDonald calls this psychosis of permanent war in the name of anti-communism. You know, war, the fusion of war, and the war profiteers, the militarists and the war profiteers, which after World War II created a situation of total war. I mean, after World War I, factories reconverted to produce domestic products. After World War II, they kept producing weapons, even though we had peace, so that we could obliterate every Soviet city 10 times over with nuclear weapons. I mean, it was nuts. But with, guaranteed cost overruns and guaranteed profits, that fusion of the militarists and the corporatists hijacked the country, disemboweled the country economically, and made war on all of those advances that had come under the New Deal. So it had both an economic impact and a political impact.
And the U.S. is undoubtedly the world's biggest, most strongest empire, history's biggest and strongest empire, but it operates in a different way than empires past. How has the notion of empire changed over the last century?
America is unique in the sense that it colonized itself. So European countries colonized India, Africa, the Spanish, and the Americas. We destroyed, through acts of genocide, our indigenous communities and plundered their resources. So you had, especially with westward expansion, the U.S. cavalry acting on behalf of the mining concerns, the railroad companies, the timber merchants. And once westward expansion was complete, by the end of the 19th century, you began expansion beyond U.S. borders. That's when you had the Cuban-American War with the seizure of Cuba and the Philippines. You began to see all sorts of gunboat diplomacy throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, in particular Central America. America expanded its power, certainly through the military force and the threat of military force, but more by cultivating indigenous elites that would do our bidding. So you saw the rise of all sorts of dictatorships, whether it was Mobutu in the Congo, or whether Somoza in Nicaragua, or the Shah in Iran, and of course we overthrew the Shah's father and then carried out a coup d'etat to replace Mossadegh, the prime minister who was going to nationalize British oil. That form of colonial power protected Western interests. That's why Allende was overthrown in 1973 and Pinochet was put in power to protect the copper industry from being nationalized. And these elites were given tremendous resources. I mean, you saw the same thing in 1954 in Guatemala with Arbenz, who wanted to challenge United Fruit's huge acquisition of Guatemalan land to give landless peasants, an ability to, carry out subsistence farming. And when that happened, the CIA raised a kind of black army, a huge propaganda effort run by Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations, who had come out of the Creole Commission. And of course, Arbenz becomes a communist in the eyes of the press, which they, through the manipulation of the press, they are able to justify this. So it's a different kind of empire in the sense that, for instance, British troops actually occupied India, although many of those troops were Sikhs, raised from the Sikhs. We find, venal elites who will do our bidding, and when people rise up against those elites, then we provide those elites with the resources by which they can crush any form of rebellion.
I wanted to talk about El Salvador in particular, because you've obviously covered extensively the horrors of U.S. wars all over that region. What did this conflict in particular reveal about the lengths the empire will go to maintain economic hegemony?
So it's 1979 and the Sandinistas win in Nicaragua. And this sets off all kinds of alarm bells because the Sandinistas, unlike Somoza, who was the dictator of Nicaragua, who was overthrown and later assassinated in Paraguay, were not going to protect U.S. business interests. And they did not want to see this spread throughout the region. And so I covered the war there from 1983 to 1988. And we saw the Reagan administration pump tremendous military, economic, intelligence resources into defeating the rebel group known as the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. When I first got to El Salvador in 1983, the FMLN was winning the war. They created, the Reagan administration, they brought in a huge helicopter fleet, 70 Hueys that they put up in the air, which made it hard for these guerrilla groups to mass in any kind of large military. In 83, I was able to go out with up to 700-800 rebels at a clip. That didn't happen anymore. They created whole black armies that were recruited from Venezuela, Chile, Honduras, and other places that didn't exist. They were ghost armies. Roughly, they call them cazador, hunter battalions. They're about 350, very well trained, very well equipped, and we would go up into Morazan and come upon the aftermath of tremendous fire, and yet there was no record of a Salvadoran army ever being there. They brought in all sorts of CIA, mostly ex-Cuban operatives, including Felix Rodriguez, who had been part of the effort to hunt down Che Guevara. Indeed, he would show us Che Guevara's wristwatch that he was wearing, taken off Che's body. So there's a kind of classic example of the heavy intrusion of empire to thwart. Half of the population in El Salvador at the time was landless. And most of the land was owned by these coffee barons, roughly 10 families, they called them, the big 10 families. It was, it was worse than serfdom. People living in tremendous poverty and deprivation. And when they tried to organize peacefully in terms of building labor unions, They were literally gunned down in the streets. I mean, they put machine guns up on the roofs of buildings in the Capitol. And then when people began to resist, the death squads, when I got to the country, were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. It was butchery, which we funded and largely orchestrated. You saw the same thing in Iraq, by the way. When things broke down in Iraq, they took James Steele, who I knew, Colonel. He had been the head of the military group in El Salvador, who had worked with the death squads. They moved him to Iraq, and he organized the Shiite death squads, which carry out a reign of terror to break the Sunni resistance. And really, if you really want to look at it, create groups like ISIS. And that's how empire works. And when you're up close, as I was for 20 years, and you see the inner workings of empire, you understand how vicious and ruthless and brutal it is. But it's, very hard to penetrate within the heart of empire that reality, so that reporters such as myself who would report on these things were under constant attack, not only from the State Department and from the government, but from, eventually I was working for the Dallas Morning News and Central America and later for the New York Times, but from our own Washington bureaus that were being spun a fictitious narrative, and we were kind of demonized as, being the fifth front of the rebel movement. And of course, 22 reporters were killed in El Salvador, some of them assassinated by the death squads. It was, the pressure that empire will put on those few reporters who attempt to go out and actually report is fierce and can even involve, the loss of life.
In reference to the Iraq War in 2003, and war is a force that gives us meaning, you said that, quote, the notion that the press was used in the war is incorrect. The press wanted to be used.
Yeah.
Isn't that the antithesis of what journalism should be, wanting to be used?
Yeah, but, journalists are careerists like anyone else, and they know how to advance within the system. So let's take, for instance, the first Gulf War, which I covered, where they had very draconian press restrictions. So you could only be in a pool. I mean, I didn't do it. I speak Arabic. I was out in the desert, and then Cheney drew up a list of 10 journalists he wanted expelled, of which I was top of the list, but they couldn't find me because I was sleeping. That was kind of ridiculous. You wouldn't think I'd be that hard to find in Saudi Arabia. No, the press goes limp in front of the military. I mean, first of all, real war correspondents, people who really know the culture of war and have covered it, I think you're talking a couple dozen. Most of them get sent over from their Washington bureau. And I mean, I would literally watch them dress up in military uniforms and go sit in a 5-star hotel in Dhahran to hear Schwarzkopf and sit in the front row. And they weren't anywhere near a war, nor did they want to go near a war. And that's true with every war I covered. Only about 10, 15%. Photographers are a little more honest because they have to get out. They don't really want to cover the war. And that's covering war is a kind of insanity. I have a kind of even empathy for that, but then you shouldn't be there. And the people who, create these kind of heroic narratives around their soldiers or their leaders and tell the story the way they're rewarded for it. They're rewarded by the institution. They're rewarded by the military itself. And in the first Gulf War, that whole pool system was not actually administered by the military. It was administered by fellow journalists. I mean, I used to call them Judenraten. It's insane. But it coupled with the fact that they didn't really want to get anywhere near the fighting, and that's the truth of it. And secondly, that they understood what was good for their career, and their career took precedence over the truth, and that's not uncommon, unfortunately.
Udo Kati has recently passed away, but he was a very prominent German journalist, and he's written a book, the English title of which you can buy for about $1,000, is something like Journalists for Sale. It was a bestseller in Germany, and publishers resisted having it translated for several years. And the way the powers arranged the situation was they allowed it to be published, but the publisher was either told or agreed privately to put the price so high as to be out of the range of anyone who was seriously interested in it. So if you've got $1,000, you can probably buy it on Amazon, unless the price has gone up to $5,000. John Whitehead, a couple years ago, wrote a piece for Global Research. John is the director of the Rutherford Institute. He's himself a lawyer and is doing everything he can to bring Americans awareness to the fact that they already live in a police state. If you're white, you may not notice it. If you're a wealthy black, you may not notice it. If you're a poor black, you knew it 10 years ago. But the article he wrote is entitled, "When It Comes to Fake News, the U.S. government is the biggest culprit." A quarter century ago, more than a quarter century ago, Carl Bernstein wrote that journalists in the past 25 years have secretly carried out assignments for the Central Intelligence Agency. There was cooperation, accommodation, and overlap. And I chatted with a couple of journalists at a meeting I was at a couple of years ago, and they denied with great vigor that there was any censorship of American journalists. And I teased a journalist friend of mine, Bob Jensen. I'd call him a friend, although I hope he remembers me. How do you teach journalism at the University of Texas when they cannot get a job practicing journalism in the United States? And in short, he responded, it's not easy. It's possible to be brainwashed. In fact, it's probably easiest to be brainwashed when you're not aware of being brainwashed. I want to discuss for a moment and then play another. Okay. The sad and uncomfortable truth is that we've been subjected to an information war for the last 17 years, at least since 9/11. And Paul Craig Roberts would date it back to Bill Clinton allowing 5 or 6 corporations to control 90 to 95% of what you hear and see. When you have that kind of power gathered into that so few hands, the unity of message is incredible, is severe indeed. Project Censored, I've referred this last time, declared a truth emergency in 2013, 5 years ago. That truth emergency was predicated on the difficulty with which Americans get information and the insouciance with which they cover it. I love that word. I learned it from Paul Craig Roberts. It means the indifference, the carelessness. Americans no longer feel that they are involved in the decision-making process, except, of course, the totally meaningless process of voting. But they no longer feel that they can gather in the streets. Something like 30 million citizens of the world gathered in the streets to oppose the planned invasion of Iraq. They totally lost heart when George W. Bush had his war machine invade Iraq anyway. There is no anti-war movement. I apologize, Ed, for saying this, but there is no anti-war movement today. No effective anti-war movement. It has the same power as who was the filmmaker that you were discussing, Russ?
Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone gets within a few feet of the truth, but he won't take it the extra several feet, because if he did, people are afraid of confronting that kind of evil. I understand that very well. In the last couple years, prop or not, an anonymous organization, has blessed us with identifying the news sites that are most dangerous. Proper Not is an anonymous organization that investigators have finally found out who is behind it. The Proper Not is an anonymous website identifying those websites that are the most dangerous. And let's see if I can go back. Yeah. Ms. Zinbars. Ms. Zinbars is an assistant professor at some small college, and she graciously included that list in the Harvard Library list of lists so that people would have access to it from the Harvard Library system. Unfortunately, what that list is a list of most, if not all, of the alternative media websites where you can get information. Information Clearinghouse.info is on it, thesaker.is is on it, globalresearch.ca is on it. Most of the websites that I use for getting adequate and realistic information are on that. But be rest assured, Google and Facebook and Twitter are protecting you from contamination. They have installed algorithms on the search machine so that they will warn you if you're approaching something with dangerous information. And I hope you feel especially safeguarded with that information. Proper Not was found out to be a project of the Atlantic Association. Atlantic Association?
Atlantic Council.
Council, thank you. The Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is a neoconservative think tank that is doing its very best to protect you from good information and lead you into the information that they want you to support. Proper Not is attempting to warn you away from the information that you may feel that you need. By the way, investigators have demonstrated that the Atlantic Council, precisely by being a Zionist agency, a Zionist neoconservative agency, is leading you in the direction that the Zionist cabal want you to go in. Namely, to believe that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, that it's surrounded by hostile, subhuman nation states, and that it needs every dollar that the United States can give it. I'm going back to the CFR report that I mentioned at the beginning of the program, at the beginning of our session. The CFR report reflects the very same Anglo-Zionist position and is pressing for a confrontation with Russia. That confrontation with Russia is totally devoid of any substance of aggression from Russia. Going to deal with a little recent history now and then have you listen to an interview that is given by Joseph diGenova. Joseph diGenova is a former federal prosecutor who has interpreted the recent controversy over the Steele dossier, the so-called hacking of the Democratic National Committee's computer. The DNC computer was leaked. It wasn't hacked. William Binney, who's the sharpest IT guy that I have ever encountered, looked at the electronic data that the FBI didn't. The FBI accepted the word of a third-party agency as to what was on the DNC computer. This is the premier investigational agency in the world, and they chose to not seize the DNC computer. If you believe that, I've got a bridge I want you to consider renting. But it was a leak. A gentleman by the name of Seth Rich probably leaked it he was an employee of the Democratic National Committee. Craig Murray, a former British diplomat, is the admitted go-between from the leaker, the leaker to WikiLeaks. Julian Assange denies that there was any Russian connection. Craig Murray denies that there was any Russian connection. Did any of you ever hear that there was no Russian connection in that leak-hack? No, that's not in the American press. That's not the information you're supposed to have, because you're supposed to listen to the information that it was hacked. And it was hacked by a Russian agent. Okay? That's one of the ways that your media is telling you that Russians are compromising your electoral system and compromising the information that you are getting. It has no basis in fact, but that doesn't matter. It's what your media is telling you. That's one source of misinformation. The other source of misinformation is that Trump is a Putin troll, that Putin has some kind of information on Mr. Trump so that Putin can control what Donald Trump does. Where did this misinformation come from? It turns out, and this is public knowledge, in April of 2016, before the election, but as the primary season was getting started, an insider told Michael Rogers, who was the director of the National Security Agency, he told Admiral Rogers that something strange was going on with the FBI sharing privileged information and the Department of Justice sharing privileged information with not only with other agencies, but with private contractors. Now, the information they had was on American citizens. NSA isn't supposed to be spying on American citizens. That's another story entirely. When Admiral Rogers got this information, this is going to be summarized in the discussion, but I want you to hear it once and then it'll make more sense when you hear it the second time. When Admiral Rogers got that information, he did a review of the information and determined that it is in fact true, that certain members of the FBI and certain members of Obama's Department of Justice were misusing NSA information and sharing that misused information with outside contractors. Admiral Rogers then went to the FISA court to tell them that this information that had been acquired illegally was being shared illegally. The members of the Department of Justice and the members of the FBI, having heard that Rogers was going to do that, already went and confessed that we inappropriately did the spying. Okay? All of this is contained in a 99-page document that if you ask for it, it is easily online. You can download it. Names are blotted out. So the names of the members of the Department of Justice of Obama's administration are blotted out. Names of the FBI are blotted out. The names of the third parties, of the contract organizations are blotted out. But the actions aren't there. Anyone can read it. When you go home tonight and hear about Devin Nunes, the Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Mr. Nunes knows what is in that 99-page document without the names being blotted out. The 4-page memo that he has written for the Intelligence Committee has those names included. And the primary reason the Democrats and the FBI don't want Devin Nunes to release it is because it's not a black eye, ladies and gentlemen. It demonstrates the complete corruption of Barack Obama's Department of Justice and the complete corruption of the FBI. Moreover, at least some of the Republican people who do not want the memo released is because the NSA has all kinds of dirt on every federal employee past GS9. Okay? GS9 is kind of a middle grade chemist. The NSA had information on an black Illinois senator before he ever thought of running for federal office. That black Illinois senator was Barack Obama. So there is dirt on everyone in the federal government that the NSA feels perfectly free to use if information gets out about the NSA. So when you hear people saying that Nunes is releasing it for political purposes, consider that the people opposing the release of that 4-page memo might be opposing it for reasons of blackmail. Now it's time to play that one clip. It's about 10 minutes long, but listen carefully and I'll play it as loud as comfortable.
So connect the dots for us and tell the significance of the fact patterns that are starting to get unraveled. Why is this a big deal?
It's a big deal because I have a saying, the FBI used to spy on the Russians. This time they spied on us. What this story is about, it's about a brazen plot to, again, exonerate Hillary Clinton from a clear violation of the law with regard to the way she handled classified information with her private server. Absolutely a crime, absolutely a felony. It's about finding out why, as the Inspector General is doing at the Department of Justice, why Comey and the senior DOJ officials conducted a fake criminal investigation of Hillary Clinton, followed none of the regular rules, gave her every break in the book, immunized all kinds of people, allowed the destruction of evidence, no grand jury, no subpoenas, no search warrant. That's not an investigation. That's a Potemkin village. It's a farce, and everybody knew it was a farce. The problem was she didn't win. And because she didn't win, the farce became a very serious opera. It wasn't a comic opera anymore. It was a tragic opera, and she was going to be the focus. What this is about a lavabo, a cleansing of the FBI and the upper echelons of the Department of Justice. We're going to discover that the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, her deputy, Sally Yates, the head of the National Security Division, John Carlin, Bruce Orr, and other senior DOJ officials and, regrettably, line attorneys, people who were senior career civil servants, violated the law, perhaps committed crimes, and covered up crimes by a presidential candidate. But more than that, they tried to frame an incoming president with a false Russian conspiracy that never existed, and they knew it, and they plotted to ruin him as a candidate and then destroy him as a president. That's why this is important. That's why connecting the dots is important, because the FBI now has to be completely reconstructed from the ground up. The men and women at the Bureau are great people. That's not who we're talking about. We never have been. We are talking about people like James Comey, McCabe, Strzok, Page, Baker, Prystepp, who was a name nobody knows. He's the head of the Counterintelligence Division, and he was the one who was involved in planning this entire crazy thing involving Fusion GPS, the false dossier, and creating evidence. This is what people have to understand. What the Bureau did was, by working with Fusion GPS and giving contractors access to highly classified information which they had no legal right to see, they needed to create something they could give to the court, the Foreign Intelligence Court, so that they could get wiretaps and surveillance taps and email taps and phone taps on the Trump people, so that if there was anything, they could find it out. Of course, there was nothing. There never was anything. And they created false facts so that they could get surveillance warrants. Those are all crimes. Every single one of those acts constitutes a crime because it was done not for a legitimate law enforcement reason, not for national security reasons, but to create a false case against a candidate, Donald Trump, a president-elect, Donald Trump, and a president, Donald Trump. The FISA court opinion of April 27th of 2017 outlines a series of illegal disclosures to contractors. It is believed that among those contractors were Fusion GPS and CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is the company that was used to bleach Hillary's computer. CrowdStrike, if what is being reported is true, and I've seen 2 reports about CrowdStrike being among the private contractors that were given access to raw 702 incidental collection of American citizens under FISA warrants. If that is true, they have committed crimes. The Bureau who gave them information committed crimes. There is huge civil liability for CrowdStrike and for the FBI officials. And right now, there's at least 2 lawsuits pending against Mr. Steele, the former MI6 agent who wrote the Steele dossier at the payment of Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS has been sued. I expect if these facts come out from the FISA court showing that these contractors got this information, they will all be sued. Now, they may declare bankruptcy and not be able to pay, but the people don't realize that this is already on the public record, that these things happen. The question which has been blanked out from this opinion is, you can see, this is all dark, all through the opinion. What they've done is they've blanked out the names of the contractors and the names of the FBI and DOJ officials who broke the law. That is going to come out. That's what Nunes has. He has all that information now. He knows what's in these blanks that the court blanked out. The court did the right thing. It's not supposed to reveal that. But once you start doing oversight, constitutional oversight, those blanks go away to Congress. And we will know shortly who the private contractors were that were allowed to break the law by the FBI. When Comey goes to visit President Trump at the White House about the Flynn case and all that, remember, the president is president at that point. There's no reason for Comey to be doing anything. If the president wanted to meet with him, he didn't have to go. He went and he told the president, for example, about the dossier. Now, why would an FBI director tell a president about this salacious document, which Comey admitted under oath there was no proof for, no validity? He was playing J. Edgar Hoover. He was blackmailing the President of the United States. He was saying, I know all about this. Now, I'm not going to say anything about it, of course. Of course, if it ever gets out, it's just going to be awful. Do you want me to stay in my job? I mean, Comey is a person so devoid of a moral compass. He describes himself as Thomas Becket. I said to somebody the other day, he's not Thomas Becket. He's the assassin, Henry II, who killed Thomas Becket. That's who Comey is. He's an assassin. He's a political assassin.
So talk about the competing narratives in the scandal world right now, and what's the important timelines that you're watching?
Well, what's fascinating to me is how the people who want to defend everything that the Bureau has done, or the Department of Justice, or the Clintons, have turned to a series of narratives to replace the truth. For example, once this whole thing broke, when President Trump said, I was spied on by the President of the United States, he was laughed at. In fact, he was spied on by the President of the United States, by Barack Obama, under Barack Obama's orders, and under the orders of John Brennan, and Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, and Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, and Ben Rhodes, the Deputy National Security Advisor. Because what they did, which was part of a scheme which began in the year 2016, was to try to figure out a way to help Hillary Clinton get elected by exonerating her in her email scandal in her private server in New York, and then she would be elected, and then the problem of Donald Trump would go away. The problem was she lost. And when she lost, they had time between the election in November of 2016 and the time between the president was inaugurated to try and do damage, to cover up what they had done with Fusion GPS and a bunch of other people before the election, and to make it perfect after the election, to secure the storyline. And so, interestingly enough, people, there are some real heroes in this story. And part of it is how you defeat these competing narratives. You'll recall that first there's the story about the dossier, the so-called Fusion GPS dossier, which we now know was developed with the assistance of the FBI, Christopher Steele, the former spy from England, Bruce Orr, a senior Justice Department official in the Obama administration, Bruce Orr's wife, who was an employee of Fusion GPS and a Russian expert. That all of a sudden became something that people got worried about on the Democratic side and on the protect the Clinton side. Then all of a sudden, when the dossier got even stronger and stronger as a result of the knowledge about Bruce Orr's involvement, the dialogue shifted. And then it became that the dossier really wasn't important because George Papadopoulos, this know-nothing young guy who had been an end-of-the-room foreign policy advisor, was the real guy who got the investigation into the president's collusion with the Russians started as a result of a drunken blathering in a bar to the Australian ambassador, who then told MI6 in London. These narratives have developed because the facts are now so strong that there was a brazen plot to exonerate Hillary Clinton, and then if she lost, frame the President of the United States with a false crime, that this is what they have been forced to do. One of the heroes in this entire story is Admiral Mike Rogers, the head of the National Security Agency. He became the head of the National Security Agency in 2014. In 2015, one of the auditors at the National Security Agency, our electronic surveillance SIGINT masterpiece from World War II, came to him and said, there's some funny things going on at the FBI with regard to 702, which of course is that part of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which allows the scooping up of huge amounts of phone call data and emails and electronic data about foreigners. And in the course of that, allows the incidental collection of information about Americans, which is supposed to be kept secret, but wasn't in this case because of the conduct of the FBI and the Obama administration Justice Department officials. Mike Rogers says, okay, let's do an audit. He does this in March of 2016. This is way in advance of the election. He then discovers, as a result of the audit, that the FBI has been sharing this secret data about Americans with not other government agencies, but private contractors. Some of those contractors apparently work for the Democratic National Committee. Some of them work for Fusion GPS. Mr. Rogers, Admiral Rogers, says, okay, the court, the FISC court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, has been lied to. They have not been told about this. And things have been told to them which are not true. He said, I'm going to the court. I'm going to tell the court. Rogers goes to the court on his own and informs the court about these problems. Now, prior to him being able to do that, the Justice Department and the FBI learn about what he's done, about the audit and what he's discovered. And so they go to the court first to inform the court that they have discovered these problems with illegal activity. Doesn't make any difference. It's too late. The court now knows what has happened. So he goes to the court, they go to the court, and then in April of 2016, the FISA court issues this 99-page opinion, which I'll bet you didn't even know about until I talked about it this morning. This opinion describes illegal activity by the FBI, illegal activity by contractors, and it calls it the improper disclosure of raw intelligence about Americans to unauthorized individuals. All of those things that the Bureau did and the contractors were crimes. Now, you wouldn't think, this is a public document now. It's been declassified. You have not seen a single story about this in the Washington Post or the New York Times. So, with this in hand, and remember, Rogers knows all about this before the election. So as soon as the election is held, Rogers determines that since there is now a president-elect who has been spied upon, he knows that Trump was the subject of a plot. So Admiral Rogers goes to visit President-elect Trump in New York in November of 2016, on the 17th of November. He's the head of the NSA. He briefs the president. And it is after that briefing, the very next day, that President-elect Trump moves his entire staff out of Trump Tower to Bedminster, New Jersey, where his golf club is, and that's where the transition team stays until Trump Tower is debugged. What Admiral Rogers did was, and this is why the president said that President Obama had wiretapped him. Rogers, on that day, November 17th, briefed the president about the illegal activities which had been reported to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court earlier in the year. And the president knew what had happened at that point. Now, interestingly enough, when the outgoing administration found that Admiral Rogers had gone to New York, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, John Clapper, and John Brennan, the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, asked President Obama to fire Admiral Rogers. Now, President Obama had many flaws, but he ain't no dummy. And he said, boys, it's too late. I'm not going to fire Admiral Rogers, because if I do, that'll be the only story about my last days in office, so you can forget it. And Rogers is there to this day, and when this story is written, when it's all over, the great hero will not be Robert Mueller, this crazy man that has been made the special counsel. It won't be the people on the Hill, except for Devin Nunes, who is a real hero, who has stood up under the most incredible personal attacks from real sleazeballs like Adam Schiff, this loony congressman from California. And it will be shown that Admiral Rogers saved the day by forcing the senior Justice Department officials to admit that they had done wrong things. Now, there's another fascinating part of this story. In October of 2016, when Admiral Rogers is going to the court and forcing the Justice Department to advise the court that they had submitted false documents, that they, the DOJ, had submitted, unwittingly had submitted false documents, as they say. Admiral Rogers, plans are being made to fire him at that point, which of course never go forward because of what he does by going to New York. All of this has come to a head at that point, and the court is now learning for the first time about this unbelievable activity. For the first time in the history of the FISA court, it has been lied to, and according to the court, systematically and ongoing violations of the law. This is stunning stuff, and it's all because of Admiral Rogers. And that's where we are today. We are now at the point where Nunes has discovered this. He discovered it back in March when he went to the White House, and all of these documents were turned over to him by the incoming National Security Council staff. And so now we'll watch it play out.
Hope you don't mind my subjecting you to hearing that twice with some slightly different words. Ordinarily, we deal with what is behind the news because we're dealing with fake history and fake science in the next several weeks. Today we happen to be dealing with fake history that has developed into fake news. There are two closely related separate storylines here that are not parallel. So somewhere in the future, they will collide. One storyline is that Russia is interfering with our election and you cannot trust President Trump. And the other storyline is Russia is our deepest enemy. They are totally responsible for this hostility and we have to be on our guard. If you listen to what is happening in the British press, if you read the Washington Post, the New York Times, this is the message you're getting. When those two lines intersect, you're going to be in a situation where Germans were in 1939 when Hitler dressed up some inmates in Polish uniforms, killed them, and laid them down and said the Polish are attacking us. Because it is clear that certain parts of the American government want a war with Russia. And it is clear that certain parts of the American government don't want Trump or anyone with a sense of responsibility interfering with that. I feel like a responsible German about 1938, because I don't know how they're going to do it. But the only way they can attack Russia is if they give the American people the impression that Russia has attacked the United States. Maybe it will be Estonian captives dressed up in Russian uniforms attacking an Estonian outpost. I don't know. But the next false flag might be the one that gives the United States government the excuse for nuking Russia. Sorry for the dramatics, but that's the way I see it. Questions or comments?
We need to figure out how to change the system that we live in. The whole thing is so corrupt that, you know, it's just ridiculous.
Both you and I are too young to emigrate to Russia.
Well, we've been great there. I've been thinking about going to Belize though. Thanks for your hard
They
work.
can get a hold of you in Belize.
Well,
If you're gonna go to somewhere in this hemisphere and go to Venezuela.
Well, you ought to get out of the traffic anyway. Thanks for your hard work. See you. See you.
Who was the speaker in that last segment?
The speaker or the speaker was Joseph diGenova. D-I, small d-I, capital Genova. And if you put that in YouTube, you'll be able to get the whole thing. Tom.
Is he some government official?
He's a former federal prosecutor. He's a Washington lawyer who formerly did contract work as a federal prosecutor. He knows the law and he knows the federal system. Interestingly enough, what he has to say about corruption in the FBI and the Department of Justice dovetails fairly well with those of you who have read anything by or about Sibel Edmonds. There are good people working for the FBI, but at certain key positions at the FBI, it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. An FBI official prevented, I forget the FBI official's name in Minneapolis, prevented an official from the FBI in Minneapolis from seizing Moussawi's computer. Now, Moussawi wasn't going to fly an airplane, but he was part of the cover story for 9/11. The same FBI agent who prevented her from seizing that computer permitted or ordered the destruction of the anthrax vials at Ames that would have allowed tracking the anthrax species that were used in the terror attacks shortly after 9/11. So that guy I wouldn't buy a used car from it.
How is China, I mean, if the US and Russia are setting what's ever going on, what would China's position be with all that?
China is willing to work with the ruling elites, but is not willing to be dominated by them. And the Russian government or the Russian people appear not to be willing to even work with them. But Russia and China need each other because the American or the Western elites aren't happy unless they are in control of the opposition. And they don't control China and they don't control Russia. For that matter, they don't yet control Iran or Venezuela either. But they can stomp on Venezuela, and they would get a big bloody nose if they tried to stomp on Iran. They act with a whole lot more bluster than they have power. But they can do a whole lot of damage even if they don't have complete control.